Okay, 4:20 or so, 4:23. Got about a half hour left of my program here. We're going to talk a little bit about intelligence, like we were talking about before the break there. So, the human brain, okay, is what we call the triune brain. Tri as in three, Trinity. Significant concept there, too. Anyway, the triune brain. The oldest and most deeply rooted part of that brain is what we call the R system, or the reptilian brain. And physiologically, it's very obvious there really are three separate structures here that are sort of molded into one another. The newer, evolutionarily newer parts of the brain wrapped around the older parts. So when I talk about the R system, and then the mammalian, the old mammalian system on top of that, I mean it physically. These are one wrapped on top of another. So what we have is what we call the reptilian brain, or the R system, and this is the oldest, evolutionarily speaking, the oldest part of our brain. It starts at the base of the neck and runs up the neck to the base of the head. And I won't go too much into the physiology of it, but in any case, the R system is responsible for all of our basic instincts, including our autonomic functions. Everything that we do without thinking about it, the R system controls that stuff. So it controls things like the fact that we breathe while we're asleep, the fact that our heart always keeps beating even though we don't think about it, the fact that our glands produce what they're supposed to produce. That stuff is maintained by the R system. In addition, what's maintained outwardly is the fight or flight complex, that sort of idea. The R system is only concerned about moving toward that which is pleasurable and away from that which is dangerous. So the R system is fundamentally concerned with survival primarily, and moving away from the dangerous and toward the pleasurable. Not necessarily beneficial. That's an important distinction. So that's the first part of the brain. The second, and not quite as old as the reptilian part of the brain that developed in mammals now, was what's called the old mammalian brain, and that's also referred to as the limbic system, or the emotional cognitive system, and that's the part of the brain that wraps around the R system, and this is where we get things like emotion, and this is where all learning occurs. It's also where memory is, where the phenomenon of memory occurs. We really can't explain it still, but some of this new neurology research is really, really cool and astounding things they're finding out. And again, it goes back to quantum mechanics, quantum physics, and non-local fields, and how the brain taps into those fields. So in any case, okay, so we have the emotional cognitive brain wrapped around the R system, wrapped around the reptilian brain, and then the most recent addition that Mother Nature has given the human brain is the new mammalian brain, or what we call the neocortex. Neo meaning new, the new cortex. So the neocortex, much, much bigger than both the reptilian brain and the emotional cognitive brain combined. The neocortex is very, very big. This is called the new mammalian brain. Now, the new mammalian brain is the neocortex, where all of our higher functioning takes place. Now, not higher learning, but higher functioning. Like this is problem solving, and advanced mathematics and physics. Those sorts of things come from the neocortex. Now, for a long time there was talk and still is, about the left hemisphere, right hemisphere, sort of one being dependent upon for certain activities and thought patterns, and the other side for other certain ideas and thought patterns, one being primarily creative, and the other side being primarily logical and objective. But it's turning out that some of that research is being turned over. There's a lot we don't know about the brain. I don't want to talk too much about the physiology about it because I'm not an expert, but I do know some of these basic concepts. So in any case, we have the neocortex now, this giant brain that's up on top of the emotional cognitive brain and up on top of the reptilian brain. This is where we have our higher functioning. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because, and let me add one more thing, the frontal lobes, what we call the frontal lobes, are the most recent evolutionary additions, and these are the most frontal part of the neocortex. Now, the interesting thing that has occurred in recent years, there is a new field of medicine that is emerging, and it is called neurocardiology. Well, neurocardiology is exactly what it sounds like. It has to do with neurology, and it also has to do with the heart. Well, what we've learned is that up to 65% of the cells that make up the heart and the pericardial sac, which holds the heart, are neurons. Now again, the implications of this are profound, because these neurons are no different than the neurons that are found between your ears, okay? And what we're learning is that there actually is an intelligence of the heart. And this intelligence of the heart is something that needs to work in concert with the neurology of the brain. And there's a direct connection between the two. But the connection has to be made first before it can continue. And what this means about intelligence goes back to what I said at the beginning of the hour, that there is a distinction that needs to be made between intellect and intelligence. Intellect is what comes from the neocortex, but is concerned only with possibility. Intellect only cares to ask the question, can it be done? Is it possible? Intellect asks the question, can it be done? Is it possible? Solve the problem. But intellect asks these questions without regard to appropriateness. In other words, intellect doesn't care about the overall well-being of the system. It is only concerned with solving problems and asking questions. Is it possible? So what you get is intellect developing technology and asking the questions, but doing it with a lack of intelligence. And this intelligence comes from the connection between the neurology of the neocortex and the neurology of the heart. And this is the difference between intelligence and intellect. Intelligence uses the neocortex and uses the ability of intellect and the higher functions of the brain. But intelligence uses those functions in a beneficial manner. Beneficial for the individual, and beneficial for the species, and beneficial for the nest in which the species must live, that being planet Earth. In other words, making sure that you don't destroy your own home. And so what we have had is this rampant, it's never happened before in history, but we have this complete separation between intellect and intelligence. And that, combined with the industrial and technological revolution, has put us in a pretty interesting predicament. Because right now we've got a lot of people running the world who are operating intellectually, but they are not operating intelligently. And the intelligence of the heart is something that has to be, first of all, it has to be learned, it has to be known about, it has to be nurtured, and it has to be realized within the individual. Now, with children, the way we raise our children, we can make these connections, and we can help the child to actually develop fully as nature intended. And that means the advancement of the intellect, but also the advancement of intelligence and this connection of the heart and the mind. And so all of the stories that we heard in the old ancient love stories and the stories that the sages told us, and that the biblical stories and the religious mythology, all of these things talk about the heart and the importance of the heart. Well, it turns out that science and biology are now bearing out what the sages told us all those years ago, and what have what the brilliant people of our society always tell us, that this balance between the heart and the mind is required if we're going to successfully move forward as a species. And right now we find ourselves in a critical situation, because we have an incredible intellect that has taken advantage of technology, computers being one of the main things, and is now being able to develop that technology and evolve that technology faster and faster and faster. And in fact, now the technology is actually evolving on its own. We have smart computers now, and we have artificial intelligences, be they rudimentary or not. And in fact, my own personal opinion is that there are, at certain levels and in certain institutions, there is technology that is much beyond what we even imagine, because what you and me get to see as Joe Public is not what's really available. It's just what's available to us, what's currently off the shelf. That stuff is typically obsolete. And the technologies that are actually real and that are being utilized for development of new technologies and are held pretty closely in corporate hands and government hands, these technologies are long, long beyond what we get off the shelf. So you can just imagine the technologies that are really at play here. And these technologies are sufficiently advanced now that when they're used in an aggressive fashion to destroy things, well, they're highly efficient. They are highly efficient. And whether they are atomic, physical in nature, whether they're electromagnetic in nature, whether they're biological in nature. We talked about genetic engineering earlier in the program, and Francis Crick, who died on Wednesday, and the implications of his work. You know, bugs that can be created now that can actually go after a specific genotype or race-specific pathogens. You know, these are things that are being talked about openly. So these things exist, chemical weapons beyond your worst nightmares. And then things that we don't even know about. So when these things start to be used in an aggressive fashion for destruction, they are highly effective. And if they become unleashed, life as we know it on this planet will change. And it will be a shock to many, many, many people if that actually goes down. Now, it's crazy because it's a double-edged sword, because they continue to develop the technology in order to thwart the technology. You have to have greater and greater weaponry, more sophisticated weaponry, more sophisticated means of detection in order to detect the sophisticated weaponry that the other guy is developing just as fast as you're developing. And what it comes down to is if you propagate that curve, you see that it's just a continuous escalation until eventually somebody starts utilizing the technology, somebody actually starts using the technology, and then it drops off the cliff. And then the technology destroys itself, or something radical happens, and we start from square one again. And this may have happened in the past. It may have happened many times in the past. Our historical perspective goes back a very, very short period of time based on the entire length of the life of the Earth and the solar system. So nature, as she developed this incredible intellect, this incredible neocortex, she also developed this neurology of the heart, this intelligence of the heart, in order to harness and have dominion over the intellect of the brain. Because the intellect without the wisdom of the heart is what we have. You get neutron bombs. You get incredible feats of engineering. You get incredible feats of mathematical theory and proof and calculation in order to do these other things. You get DNA manipulation and discovery of helix structures like Francis Crick did 50 years ago. This is what intellect does. But when intellect is devoid of intelligence, you run into problems. And that's where we are on planet Earth. So, I encourage everyone to learn a little bit about intellect and intelligence and the difference between the two. And as you're trying to develop your intellect, understand that you have to develop your intelligence as well. And this intelligence primarily comes from your heart. And this is not New Age, mamby-pamby BS. This is now scientific fact, physiological fact. The medical field of neurocardiology is real. Only very forward-thinking researchers and doctors are working in the field. Why? Because there's no money in it. And the reason that these things don't get fully developed is because the grant money and the research money goes to, typically, the current paradigm of research and the researchers that are running that paradigm. And it happens in energy, just like it's happening in medicine, and it happens in many, many different areas of human endeavor. But historically, we have seen that the people on the fringe are usually the ones that are the leading edge of the new knowledge. And with regard to neurocardiology, that's definitely happened now, and we're in the middle of it, and it's an incredibly exciting time to learn about these things, because this is what's going to be required if our species is going to survive the development of all of this technology. It has to be harnessed. It has to be used with wisdom. And if we can do that, well, then we can change the world. But we literally are, we're balancing. We're on a tightrope right now. We're walking on a razor's edge between paradise and Armageddon. And the slightest shift of weight and energy and focus in one direction or another, it seems, will push over the edge toward one of those two potentialities. But something new is coming, and the technology is not going to allow the status quo, business as usual for anybody, even the people who own the world, as my friend Terrence used to say. Even the people who own the world with their long-term and short-term projections, they understand that if you propagate these themes, these concepts of what's really happening right now behind the scenes, well, business as usual is no longer an option. We'll be back in a minute. This is Radio Orbit on KOPN. Okay. 420.